Hello everyone, hi, my name's Gerard Stewart. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Natural Flood Management Research Programme. So welcome to the latest in our series of webinars. Can I just check, can you hear me okay? Can somebody let me know if you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great, thank you. So I need to let you know, first of all, we are recording this webinar, so please keep your microphones turned off and your videos off during the presentation to avoid background noise and distractions. Today we have Dr. Salim Goudarzi and David Milledge from the University of Newcastle. They're part of the Protect-NFM project, and they're going to be presenting on quantifying the impact of blanket peat, re-vegetation and gully blocking in terms of their NFM potential. Just before I hand over to them, please do ask questions, please make comments, and please use the chat function to do that. We've had some quite lively discussions on the chat, and so yeah, please do make use of that. And yeah, I mentioned we're recording the webinar, and it will be available on our website, as are all the previous webinars, if you've missed some. So if colleagues have missed it or you want to hear it again, it's available there. So before I hand over to Salim and David, just a little bit of background on the research programme. It's a 4-year, £4 million programme funded by NERC, and we're carrying out novel science to improve the understanding of natural flood management, where possible, including quantification. We're looking at a range of NFM measures in different types of catchments, flooding scenarios, and at different scales. And the aim is to improve the evidence and understanding for policymakers, practitioners and researchers. There are 3 projects that make up the programme, and today we're going to hear from some representatives from the Protect-NFM project. Again, you can find out more about those projects, the other projects, via our website, and they each have their own websites actually, which you can link through to. And a really important part of our work is working with partners and drawing on their expertise and engaging them in our work. Ultimately, we want to take on the recommendations from the work as well. So that's really important, and really this webinar programme is part of that engagement. So without further ado, I will hand over to Salim.
Hello everybody.
Hi Salim, good, I can hear you.
Can you see my slides as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Salim Goudarzi, and together with David Milledge, we performed the numerical modeling part of the NFM project. Today, as Gerard mentioned, we're going to talk about quantifying the impact of blanket peat.
Salim, sorry to interrupt. You're not very clear. Can you speak a bit closer to the microphone, perhaps?
Is that better?
Yeah.
Is there any better?
Yeah, that's better, I think. Yes. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
So today we're going to talk about quantifying the impact of blanket peat, re-vegetation, and gully blocking in terms of their NFM potential. We're going to start with introducing the observational data that we have, a before-after control intervention experiment. And we'll tell you about the findings of the experiment, which leads to the motivations for the numerical work, why people decide that it was a good idea to do what we've done. I've tried to keep the numerical and technical parts of it to a very minimum, but please do ask questions at the end if you're interested about the numerical model aspect of the work. And during this numerical work, we've done 2 numerical experiments to quantify the impact of restorations and study their variations with storm size, and also to try and understand the underlying processes that drive the observed effects of these interventions. Followed by scenarios where NFM interventions might be less effective as a flood peak reduction. So the BACI experiment, which stands for before-after, the sites were in Kinder Scout Plateau, which is just southeast of Manchester. This experiment provides the first controlled catchment scale experimental evidence of the impact of these interventions on peak reduction and lag time increase. These catchments are characterized with large expanses of bare peat areas and deeply incised gullies, as you can see in the right of the slide. Intensive monitoring started in June 2010 for 15 months, which forms the pre-intervention data set, followed by 32 months of post-restoration monitoring beginning in early 2012. These in the BACI setup, they've chosen 3 football pitch size catchments, as you can see in the top panel of the slide. So CR is the control site, which remained unchanged during the experiment for the duration of the experiment. RV site is the revegetated site, and the RG is the revegetated and gully block site. So the revegetation was done by using grass and fertilizer, and the gully blocking used stone dams in larger, deeper gullies and timber dams in smaller tributary gullies. In total, there were 37 gully blocks, 20 of which were timber dams and 17 stone dams. So during the BACI experiment, it was observed that the water tables rise following the intervention, which would mean that the catchment hill slope storage is reduced because the water tables are higher, which results in additional production of overland flow, which could at first sight mean that these interventions are actually encouraging surface flow production, and maybe they're not good for flood peak production. But when we look at the magnitude of the change in the discharge, we can see that except for 2012, this reduction was always more in the block side than it was in the revegetated side. In overall, over the course of the 3 years post restoration monitoring, gully block side reduced the peak magnitude by 51%, and re-vegetation reduced to about 27%. And the lag time increase was around 26 minutes in the revegetated site over average over the 3-year course restoration, and around 30 minutes for the revegetated and gully block site. So despite the raise in water table and enhanced production of surface flow, we did observe a reduction in peak discharge and lag time, which suggests that the additional production of surface runoff is somehow stored in some sort of surface storage. We distinguish between, or we conceptualize surface storage in 2 different categories: static or immobile storage, which could be things like interception storage, also known as canopy storage of vegetation, which could hold some of the rainfall that might seem trivial because the leaves are very small, but when summed up across a whole catchment may be significant. And also the volume of water that comes behind the block. And we call them static or immobile because for the time scale of the storm, this volume of water is effectively intact and generally doesn't contribute to runoff. And the second category of surface storage is a mobile or dynamic surface storage or flow storage. And the way we conceptualize this is that during each storm, there's some water that takes some time to be delivered to the outlet. And it's controlled basically by the velocity of overland flow in a way that if the flow moves slower, then there's more accumulation of water on the surface. So therefore the dynamic surface storage will increase. And if the surface is smoother, like on bare peat areas, then there's less time for flow to accumulate. So this dynamic surface storage will be reduced. And that's how we think vegetation, for example, or even gully blocking, is increasing the dynamic surface storage. And the reason why we know, or how we know, that the dynamic surface storage following these interventions is more important is because when we look at the runoff coefficients following interventions, we realize that runoff coefficients haven't changed. So runoff coefficients tell us about what percentage of the rainfall becomes runoff. So if all the rain that falls on a catchment appears at the outlet, then runoff coefficients are 100%. But if, for instance, we capture 20% of the rainfall, let's say in a gully block, we can trap it in a gully block, then the runoff coefficients are going to be 80%. These figures don't tell us how much the runoff coefficients were, but they show us that they don't change in the right side of the slide, where we can see the difference in runoff coefficients with the control side. We don't see a significant difference in runoff coefficients, which suggests that the additional surface production of water was all of it basically delivered to the catchment, at least compared to before the intervention. So to summarize, we know from the BACI experiment that water tables rise, which results in a reduction in catchment hill slope storage and encourages overland flow production. But despite this enhanced overland flow production, we still observe lag time increase in peak reduction following interventions. And therefore we know that the dynamic storage is more important. And the way we know that is when we look at the runoff coefficients. And from that, we can infer that roughness is more dominant because dynamic surface storage is driven by velocity, and velocity is driven by surface roughness. And also, we know that gully blocking is very significant in its impact. But there are other things that we would like to know. For instance, is dynamic surface storage always more important? Are there situations where static surface storage, such as gully block storage, becomes important? If it is always more important, how much more important is it? What about evapotranspiration? When is evapotranspiration important, and by how much? And also, we'd like to know if these findings hold for different storm sizes. Is there any correlation with storm size? And also, there were some differences between the catchment's response to rainfall prior to interventions, which suggests that there were differences in catchment rainfalls potentially, and definitely differences in topography. Whether these differences were significant or not, we don't know, but we would like to eliminate them if we can. And also, we would like to look at situations where NFM interventions or restoration interventions would be less effective in terms of NFM. And the way we do that, we employ a numerical model, in particular top model, in conjunction with the BACI experiment that I just described. So the way we go about doing that, we pick two periods, one representing the before intervention situation, the conditions, and the second one, the after intervention conditions in each of the sites. We input them through the model, and then we rigorously calibrate the model with these two different data sets. And this way we get parameters that represent dynamic surface storage, evapotranspiration rate, and static surface storage for each of these interventions in the pre and post period. And then we use these parameter values to conduct some numerical experiments that we can then infer processes from. I'm just going to quickly show you the periods that we picked for our pre and post intervention calibration. So we chose 22nd of August to 6th of October 2010 as pre-intervention period. I'm just showing you the main events here, and only the rainfall records for the control side. The rainfall records for the other sides were very slightly different in some of the time steps, but not significantly different. Whether that difference is important or not, we don't know, but if we can eliminate it, we would like to do so. And also, as you can see, for example, in the left panel at the bottom and the middle panel, there's more difference between the re-vegetated sites in their response to rainfall. There's more difference between RV and the control site than there is difference between RG and the control site. We would also like to eliminate that difference if we can in our numerical model. And we chose the same exact period, i.e. 22nd of August to 6th of October 2012 as the post-intervention period for our calibration. Here again, I'm only showing the main events. And by doing so, we've minimized the possibility that seasonality would affect our results because the exact same periods were used in each year. In the bottom left panel, we can see that Both interventions, firstly, do indeed reduce the peak and increase lag times. And we can see that in the first two panels on the left. It's harder to say for the most complex storm that we've looked at, which is the third panel on the right. Both interventions do still reduce the peaks. Lag times are slightly harder to conclude because the peaks are very complicated. Sometimes they merge into clear. So when we calibrate our model to these two periods, the 2010 and 12, we get different parameter sets pertaining to each catchment and period. And then we would like to use those parameters to conduct two numerical experiments. In numerical experiment 1, we look at the impact of restorations, as in we would like to quantify them, having removed uncertainties such as differences in rainfall and topography, and see if that makes any difference when compared to the BACI observations. And also we would look at the variation of these impacts with storm size. Again, I've tried to keep it very brief, but if you do like to know more about our procedures, do ask questions at the end of the talk. But in numerical experiment 1, we fix the topography and the rainfall to drive our model, and then we input the model with the parameter sets we've just calibrated to the period, to the pre and post-intervention period, and predict a discharge. Then we get to compare these discharges without having to worry about they're coming from different topographies and driven by different rainfalls. So in this figure, these are the results of the virtual twin numerical experiment and numerical experiment 1. In the top row, I'm only showing the largest storms in our data set, and in the bottom, the most complex storm. Things that are very immediately obvious are that, so firstly, you would want to compare hotter colors with colder colors. So red and magenta are the pre-restoration conditions in revegetated sites and revegetated and gully plot sites, RV and RG respectively. And the cooler colors represent the post-restoration condition. We can immediately see that post-restoration the peaks are lower for both interventions, and lower yet for the gully block phase. And also the hydrographs are generally smoother. We think this smoothing that's occurring is due to reduction in the velocity that happens following revegetation and gully blocking. The numbers in each panel are peak ID numbers, which I'm going to refer to some of them later on in other slides. Although peaks reduce in almost all peaks and lag times increase, but this reduction in peak and increase in lag time is not the same in all storms, not in all peaks. That got us thinking whether there's any correlation with storm size. So in the next slide, we plot the impact of interventions versus peak magnitude on the x-axis. So on the left is left panel looks at the correlation between peak discharge and the peak discharge reduction and storm size. There's generally no correlation. The largest peaks, the value of the peak reduction for the largest peaks, which are peak 2 and 4, lie in the middle of the range. So I would say that there is no correlation that is easily observable with storm size in terms of peak magnitude reduction. There is some correlation when we look at the lag time increase on the right. There is some correlation with peak size, with storm size, where lag time increase tends to be smaller for larger storms. Although this is not a very clear correlation, but there is some correlation. Generally speaking, pretty much for all peaks, re-vegetation predicts less of a discharge reduction when compared to re-vegetation in gully block case. Same goes for lag time increase. The gully block sites predicts more of a lag time increase when compared to the re-vegetated site in the yellow square. The mean lag time, the mean peak reduction across all 20 peaks predicted by our numerical model was 34% for the revegetated site, and the mean lag time and the mean peak discharge reduction was 43% for the gully block case. The lag time, on the other hand, was around 37 minutes for the revegetated sites on average across all peaks, and around 48 minutes for the gully block sites across all peaks. There's generally a large variability with the storm size, even though there is a correlation. So ideally, we think that this variability means that there's some storm properties that correlate with some processes in this intervention. So we would like to know what those processes are and how they correlate with storm size. But before that, I thought it would be good to compare the model predictions with the BACI experiment. So we only modeled 2012 data. In the BACI experiment, the peak reduction predicted by these interventions was slightly less in 2012 for the gully block site, which was a bit of an anomaly. But our model actually predicts more of a peak reduction in 2012 for the gully block site, which is more in line with the predictions in the following years, in 2013 and 14, where revegetated and block site predicts significantly more peak reduction than it does in a revegetated site. And I will also point out that the range of the peak reductions, as is indicated by the error bars in the black error bars, which are the modeled ones, the ranges correspond really well to the observations, which is very encouraging. It suggests that the model does predict the ranges very well. So this difference in peak reduction prediction by the model and observations could be due to the fact that we've minimized some uncertainties regarding to topography by fixing topography and rainfall, or it could be due to smaller sample size that we use compared to the BACI experiment. We've only looked at 2 peaks, 20 peaks in total. In the BACI experiment in 2012, they roughly looked at 50 peaks. So that difference could be causing this discrepancy that we see here. But if this is due to eliminating uncertainties regarding topography and rainfall, then this suggests that if we extrapolate to 2013 and 2014, there's a potential that the effects of gully blocking is underestimated in the observations, but it's something for us to maybe model later and see what kind of model predictions we get for those years. So that leads me to the second numerical experiment that we did to understand firstly what are the underlying processes that drive these intervention effects, and what is their correlation with, if any, with storm charge. So in this experiment, the setup is very similar to the first experiment. So we again fix the topography and rainfall and input it to the model. But this time we fix all the parameters to the pre-treatment conditions, except one that we switch to the post-treatment values. And this way, any change that we observe in the model predictions in discharge, then we can assign it to that one parameter being switched to its post-intervention value. So this is just in the schematic on the right. So this assumes that if we, for example, kept evaporation at its post-intervention value in each site, then then any difference we observe in the discharge predictions should be due to evapo-transpiration. So when we do that for all parameters, then we can understand, or we can estimate the share of each parameter in causing the intervention impacts relative to other parameters, which is what we see in this figure. So on the left is share of each parameter in discharge change, and discharge change is primarily to discharge reduction, unless it's negative. And so in the re-vegetated site on the left, for the smaller storms, evapotranspiration seems to be controlling the magnitude of the peaks. But once we go to the larger storms, then velocity, which controls the dynamic storage, becomes the primary driver of peak reduction. Although evaporation is much less important, but it's not negligible. And what's interesting about the re-vegetated site is that the static storage, which represents interception storage of vegetation, seems to be almost insensitive or ineffective as a parameter that would cause reduction in peak, which suggests that the additional interception storage added by revegetating to bare peat areas is not significant, and does not add significant amount of storage to the system to reduce the peaks. On the other hand, on the right side, for the revegetated and gully block case, for the smaller storms, this time evapotranspiration is still important in smaller storms, but static storage becomes significantly more important when compared to the revegetated side, which suggests that for a smaller storm, the additional storage added behind the block can be considerable in reducing the peak. In larger storms, however, the story remains the same. Velocity is by far the most important parameter controlling the reduction in peak, followed by evaporation. What's interesting to note when we compare these two sites is that the role of velocity has almost doubled in larger storms. So velocity alone, when we switch velocity alone to its post-intervention values, can cause almost 100% of the peak reduction we observe. Note that sometimes we can have more than 100%. This is because these are relative changes, these are not absolute changes. So that does not suggest that velocity alone for example, can produce 150% of the impact that we see as in discharge reduction. This is just relative changes. It just means that velocity for that particular storm was 3 times more important than evaporation, for instance. If evaporation is 50% and velocity is 150%, that just means velocity is 3 times more important. And it does not tell us anything about the absolute magnitude of these parameters. When we look at the parameter switch experiment for the lag times, the story is a lot more simpler because evaporation and static storage are pretty much insensitive, or lag time rather is pretty much insensitive to the changes in these 2 parameters, suggesting that static storage, first of all, it fills up quickly at the maybe first few minutes of the storm, such that the filling of it does not increase the lag time considerably independent of storm size. And lag time, regardless of the intervention, is always controlled by velocity or dynamic scale. So when we, during our virtual twin experiment, we observed that there are times that interventions don't seem to be reducing the peak discharge much. So when we compare peak 1 and peak 3, even though the observed values of the peak, which is the black line, are very similar in terms of magnitude, when we switch pre and post parameters for either intervention, we don't observe a significant amount of peak reduction. Even though we can see in peak 3 that peaks are indeed delayed, but it's just that this delay doesn't provide significant lower attenuation. So when we take a closer look at these 2 hydrographs, the only noticeable difference between the 2 is in the rainfall. So peak 1 is driven by rainfall that has a peak intensity duration of only 10 minutes, whereas peak 3 is driven by rainfall that its duration of peak rainfall intensity is almost 70 minutes. But also when we look at the mean lag times provided by these interventions, which are 0.62 hours for re-vegetation and 0.8 hours for gully blocking, roughly around 37 minutes for the vegetated side and 48 minutes for the gully block side. So when we take into account the lag times that these catchments can provide, then we realize that, so in peak 1, the duration of peak rainfall intensity is always less than the mean lag times that these catchments provide. And therefore, in peak 1, this lag time also attenuates the flow. This delaying the flow also attenuates the flow. But in peak 3, because the duration of the peak rainfall intensity is longer than the lag time provided by these catchments, this delay doesn't result in significant flow attenuation. Maybe this is a good time to remind ourselves that we're talking about catchments and blanket peat in headwaters. So water that is coming out of these catchments is just part of what would constitute a flood wave, let's say, in downstream. So the fact that there are situations where we can delay the peak but not produce its magnitude doesn't necessarily mean that it's been a waste of time in terms of NFM, because delaying the peak from one headwater catchment, for example, could contribute to the total or to the flood wave that reaches a community downstream, community at risk. Unless somehow by accident that delay causes peaks to sink from other headwater catchments. But whether these long duration peak rainfalls are happening frequently enough for anyone to worry about or not, I think it requires a intensity, duration, frequency analysis for the storms in the sites of interest. But we're just unpacking this, so it's something for us to look at later on. So in conclusion, the main conclusion of this presentation is that the modeling supports the BACI findings, and that peaks are indeed reduced and lags increase following re-vegetation and gully blocking, and that roughness due to re-vegetation and gully blocking is the primary driver of the observed impacts by increasing what we call the dynamic or mobile surface storage. And this surface storage is the primary delivery mechanism of these interventions. And that does not vary with storm size, as we saw in the previous plots, where the role of the share of velocity in reducing the peak and increasing lag time was always very important, independent of storm size. And also that some storm properties, such as duration of rainfall intensity, is perhaps something to take into consideration, because it can strongly alter the discharge, for instance, even though not the lag increase. These are some things that we're thinking about doing in the not so distant future. From me, if you have any questions.
Thanks very much, Salim. Very interesting. And yeah, David's been busy on the chat answering some questions that have been coming in. So yeah, please do ask more questions. We've got about 15 minutes now for questions. We did have some that people sent in prior to the webinar, so perhaps if I ask a couple of those. Can you say anything about how the research will be developed and into a state where it can be applied? How will the findings be turned into recommendations that can influence action on the ground?
First, they need to be upscaled, because so these are very small size catchments, football pitch size catchments, and interventions were applied across 100% of the catchment, which is probably not practical in a headwater catchment scale, let's say. So if we can manage to implement 20% re-vegetation in some catchments, and also it depends which parts of the catchment. So for them to become practical, they need to be upscaled and perhaps optimized in the sense that which parts of the catchments you would like to revegetate, and which parts of it you want to gully block, and what the configuration of gully blocks should be. But I guess the main message is that these interventions can and will contribute to peak flow reductions and lag time increase. But yeah, I would say upscaling is key to.
And is that upscaling sort of part of the Protect project?
numerically speaking, at least I know, because we have it in our scope, is actually the next on the line for us to do. Whether anyone wants to implement it in the field, I'm not aware of.
Can I butt in?
Yeah, hi David.
Hi. So thinking about how this translates into practice, I can see three ways that it translates. Sal's spoken to the first two, which would be, can you give us some indication of how much impact we might expect if we applied this at scale? And if we had some freedom about where to do it, can you help us to target the interventions? And to do that, we need to scale up from what we've done at the moment. And as Sal said, that's next on the to-do list. The other place is, as we start to understand the processes better, can we change what we do at the micro scale to have a bigger impact on the processes? And that's really where this piece of work is a small but a real contribution that can make a difference to practice. And that's around another piece of evidence suggesting that the roughness effect is particularly important. That when roughness generates, in Sal's language, dynamic storage, that kind of roughness related velocity slowing effect is a good way to reduce peak discharges and increase lag times that is retained through the small storms, but also into the moderately large storms. And as Tom picked up in the chat, we haven't pushed that on to the really big storms yet, partly because we haven't, partly because that's another kind of aspect of the work that we want to do this first, and then start to think about storm properties. There's also something that was a surprise to me, which is that gully blocks introduced to really restore the peat that were focused on raising the water tables do have an appreciable impact in terms of their roughness property. I imagined that once they were full, they were primarily a store, and once you'd filled them up, they didn't really have much impact. And we're still thinking this through, but the results Sal's generating suggest that there is a roughness component to these blocks. We think you can design blocks better if you're willing to allow them to fill and empty more frequently, simply by putting a hole lower down in the block. But it's interesting to me that even these blocks, which are designed to fill to the brim and to empty only very, very slowly over timescales much longer than a storm, that they still have some impact that's bigger than just the effect of filling up at the very start of a storm.
Okay, thanks, David. Another question, perhaps both relates to this project, but also perhaps more generally, if you've got any broader comments, is how do you get stakeholders to have confidence in model outputs?
Again, I can speak to this one first, and Sal, you can interrupt me or chip in. My experience of this probably comes from other projects before this one, mostly, and it would be that it helps if the stakeholders see the process as well as the product, and so this is probably one a small part of that in that you're seeing product, but it's not final product. And we're interested to hear what you think about it. It's probably still going to be the best part of a year before it is out in journal form, and so there's still time to for what we do and how we do it to be influenced. The way that we've had stakeholder interaction on this piece of work so far has mostly been implicit in talking to people in our steering group and talking to people in the field and seeing how those comments about how they see the system, how people see the system working and what they think is important seep into our practice.
Okay, thank you. Great. Another question is about, have you done any work on the financial cost-benefit ratios to enable comparison with more traditional flood risk management measures?
I can answer that because it's quick. The quick answer is no. At the moment, we've been using the model as a tool. So the scale that we're working at the moment doesn't lend itself to that kind of exercise, and so maybe unsatisfyingly, we're kicking that down the road and saying that that needs the next piece of analysis we've already talked about, where you scale up.
Okay, thanks. There's a question as well about the evidence on the role of lowland peatlands, valley mire restoration in natural flood management. Can you say anything about that?
I'll pass back to Sal now and say, because he's the one who knows this better than I do. So Sal, if you had to translate this from upland peat like we see up in the South Pennines, what do you think we can take away from it?
I don't know. I think for instance, the roughness effect that we think is our main finding. I don't see how that would be different. I would say, yeah, the fact that roughness will be the driver. It's going to be the same in the lowlands as well. But I'm not quite sure what else.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I'd say the other thing, so that comes directly out of the work that Sal's been doing. The other thing that comes out of what he's been doing, but also from lots of other projects, is to think carefully about storage and when that storage is mobilized. So assuming that the volume of water behind a pond that you generate can be turned into a discharge reduction, needs some intermediate steps about when that pond fills with water, and therefore when it's removing the water that would contribute to the downstream discharge.
Okay, thanks. We've got, well, there's one more pre-submitted question. I think David's answered the questions we've had on the chat. So if you have got questions, please, we've got a couple more minutes. So please do type them into the chat, and it's a chance to get a response direct from David or Sal. Having said that, if you've got questions that you think of afterwards, then please do. You can email them through.
One question from Tom Nisbet. Did you examine the effect of leaky dams? I presume this was solid dams. You're right, Tom, there were two types of dams. There are stone dams, which are big piles of cobbles. They are leaky, but become less leaky over time as they fill with bits of peat. And there are wooden dams. The wood dams are not leaky, so they have a slot. They look like the pictures that Sal showed at the start. They've got a slot at the top. We didn't examine the effect of leaky dams because we've been quite tightly focused on this numerical experimental design, where we train the model on the pre-intervention, we train the model on the post-intervention, we look at how the parameters changed, and then we do this experiment of virtual twins. We're currently gathering some in the Protect project, gathering experimental data on different kinds of leaky dams, and we're looking forward to trying to model those different features.
Great, thanks, David. So yeah, the last question we had sent in beforehand was, does revegetation, peatland regeneration in brackets, reduce annual flow rates in the catchment? If we compared flow duration curves from pre to post revegetation, would we see a reduction in annual flow? I presume we would have to see land use change of over 20% to see a measurable change within a given catchment.
Go on.
Happy to speak to that, Sam.
Yeah.
So we're talking here about 100% intervention in football field size catchments. So we can't yet say something from this about how much of the catchment you need to intervene in order to see your appreciable effect. Other people have been working on that, but not us, so I'm not going to talk about it. It doesn't seem fair or sensible.
Yeah.
The flow duration curve effect, yes, you'll see. I think we've seen both a shift and a change in shape of the flow duration curve, and that's something that Emma Shuttleworth and co-workers have already shown for these sites using their before-after control impact experimental design. And so we're kind of piggybacking on top of that, just trying to get a little bit more insight into the processes that might have been driving that. They've kind of already got the headline findings in terms of discharge changes from these sites for those first interventions.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, actually, we've run out of time now, so just if I can find my closing slide. Where's it gone? And anyway, thanks very much to Salim and David for your presentation and answering the questions so fully. If you do have any feedback on how it went or follow-up questions, please do email us. There we go. Slow to open. Yeah, please do email us. Let us know. As I said, the recording will be available on the website in the next couple of days, and as our other recordings of previous webinars. The next webinar is on the 24th of September. So we've got Chris Utley from the Environment Agency, who's going to talk about the Environment Agency's NFM work and the perspective on environmental land management systems, ELMS, which are essentially replacing the European laws that we're moving on from. And finally, if Emma, I saw in the chat, Emma Shuttleworth has asked people if you're interested to sign up to the Protect newsletter. There's also a program newsletter, and if you sign up to that, we'll keep you updated on future webinars. So they're roughly quarterly, so you won't get it won't be excessive emails coming through. And so yeah, just finally, thanks again to Sal and David, and for everyone who's attended, and hopefully we'll see you again on our next or future webinar. So thanks again, and good afternoon to everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.